It happened quietly. No armies, no rebellions, no treason trials. Just a cold room in Ludlow Castle, the flickering of a dying candle, and a boy, barely 15, drenched in fever, shaking as if the plague itself had gripped the future of England by the throat. Prince Arthur, heir to the Tudor dynasty, the hope of an entire kingdom, the child born to secure peace after decades of civil war, lay gasping for breath. The walls around him were draped with tapestries meant to celebrate victory, but tonight they absorbed the sound of a dying prince. Outside his chamber, the March wind howled, as if nature itself was warning those who listened. Something is ending. When the final breath escaped Arthur's lips, the candle sputtered and died, and with it, so did the future Henry VII had spent his entire life clawing and bleeding to build. Arthur's body was still warm when Henry VII, the king who had survived exile, war, conspiracies, and impostors, felt something he had not felt since Bosworth Field. Fear. Pure, paralyzing fear. Because the truth Henry VII understood in that moment was not simply that his son was dead. It was that the Tudor dynasty might die with him, and the fear that entered Henry that night would consume the rest of his life. But before we descend into the psychology, the gold, the paranoia, and the icy transformation of a king into something colder, like this video and subscribe to Hidden Crowns. Because history does not only belong to kings who won, but to kings who broke. Henry VII is remembered as the quiet Tudor, the cautious one, the accountant king, the shadow before the storm of Henry VIII. But that is the lie history tells. Because behind the numbers, behind the treaties, behind the calm facade, was a man haunted by something far darker than politics. He had survived betrayal at every turn. He had fled across the sea, hunted like prey. He had fought a king on a muddy battlefield with little more than hope and French loans. He had faced pretenders who nearly overthrew him, rebellions that nearly broke him, conspiracies that nearly killed him. Henry VII lived every day of his reign expecting someone to come for his crown. And then, the one person he trusted to secure that crown died. Arthur was not merely his son. He was Henry's proof that he had won the Wars of the Roses. He was the shield that protected the Tudors from Yorkist revenge. He was the living guarantee that the dynasty would survive. Without Arthur, all the ghosts of the past returned, and Henry's mind snapped back into the fear of a young exile hiding in foreign courts. The paradox is this: the death of his son, the child meant to bring England peace, dragged Henry VII back into the survival instincts he thought he had left behind. Instead of the cautious, balanced king historians imagine, Arthur's death turned Henry into someone else entirely, a man obsessed with gold, a man terrified of rebellion, a man who trusted no one, not even his own surviving son, a man who believed that control was the only path to survival. The death of Prince Arthur reshaped not just Henry VII, but Henry VIII, the entire Tudor world, and England itself. This is the truth history never says aloud. Arthur's death is the wound at the root of the Tudor dynasty. To understand why Arthur meant everything to Henry VII, you must return to the beginning. England in 1485 was shattered. 30 years of civil war had carved the crown into a symbol of chaos. Every noble family believed they had a claim. Every supporter of York dreamed of returning to power. Henry VII was not a powerful prince when he claimed the throne. He was a political miracle. A man with barely any legitimate royal blood. A man who spent more time in hiding than at court. A man whose supporters were half-hearted mercenaries and desperate exiles. A man whose claim was weaker than the pretenders who later rose against him. But Henry VII possessed something they did not: unyielding will. He crossed the Channel with a rented army, won a crown on a battlefield, and married Elizabeth of York to fuse two warring houses into one fragile dynasty. Arthur was born almost immediately, timed so perfectly that it was practically political theater. A Tudor prince born into peace, a symbol of unity, a promise that the bloodshed was over. Henry believed that Arthur's birth was divine confirmation that his rule was legitimate, that God had forgiven England, that the Tudors were meant to reign. And then that divine favor was ripped away. When the letter arrived at Greenwich, Henry VII did not open it immediately. Something in the way the courier held himself, the trembling hands, the pale face, told him everything. Henry locked himself inside his chamber. He read the letter. He said nothing. Elizabeth of York, Arthur's mother, rushed to him. And the King of England, the man who had outwitted pretenders, subdued armies, and survived exile, collapsed sobbing into her arms. But tragedy does not end there. Because only a few days later, Elizabeth of York herself died in childbirth. Henry lost his son. Then he lost his wife. Then he lost his shield against the past. It broke him. Those who saw him said he aged 10 years in 1 week. They said his eyes were hollow, his voice cracked, his mind darkened. Henry VII, the king forged in fear, was consumed by it once more. This was the moment he changed. The careful strategist became a hoarder. The pragmatic politician became a paranoid tyrant. The father became a ghost. The man who once fought to unite England now fought simply to survive it. After Arthur's death, something shifted in Henry VII so dramatically that even his closest advisers whispered about it behind closed doors. He withdrew from the court. He avoided celebrations. He spoke less and watched more. And he began to build something, not a kingdom, but a fortress made of coin. Henry VII had always collected fines, bonds, and payments, but now it became an obsession. Every noble family in England found themselves trapped in a web of financial control. Every rebellion, real or imagined, resulted in crushing penalties. Every slight against the crown became an excuse to seize property. Henry's treasury swelled, and he clung to that gold as if it could shield the dynasty from death itself. He had lost Arthur. He refused to lose England. But this obsession came at a cost Henry VIII would later repay in blood. After Arthur's death, Henry VII became a man who trusted nothing and no one. Not the nobles who bowed before him, not the alliances he had forged, not the treaties he had signed, not even the stability he had spent decades building. The king who once navigated political chaos with quiet brilliance now walked through his own palace like a hunted animal. He feared rebellion. He feared conspiracies. He feared Yorkist heirs rising from ashes he thought he had buried. He feared God's judgment. He feared fate turning against him once more. And beneath all of those fears, deeper than any political anxiety, he feared loss. The loss of Arthur. The loss of Elizabeth. The loss of the Tudor dream. Henry VII had clawed his way to the throne through exile and war. Now, he feared that destiny would claw him back. Fear grew inside him like a second heart. A colder one, a harder one. One that beat not with hope, but with constant calculation. This was not Henry VII, who took Bosworth Field with courage and daring. This was a king who survived by tightening his grip until his people could no longer breathe. Before tragedy consumed him, Henry VII had already been cautious with money. But tragedy transformed caution into obsession. He began hoarding coins with a desperation that startled even his closest advisors. Gold became more than wealth. Gold became security. Gold became a shield against fate itself. If he could not protect his family, if he could not guarantee a peaceful succession, then at least he could build a fortress of gold around what remained of his dynasty. This was the psychology historians sanitize, but which contemporaries saw clearly. Henry VII did not save money, he hid inside it. He demanded bonds from nobles for the slightest offenses. He imposed fines for imagined slights. He punished minor rebellions with financial ruin. He transformed the crown into a machine that devoured wealth in exchange for survival. The treasury swelled beyond anything England had ever seen, but each coin was stained with fear. Courtiers said Henry walked through his counting rooms at night, touching the chests of gold as if he needed to reassure himself that control had not slipped away. This was not greed, this was grief masquerading as ledger entries. This was a king who believed that the higher his walls of gold rose, the safer his remaining son, Henry, the future Henry VIII, would be. But nothing corrupts faster than fear disguised as prudence. Arthur's death did not only destroy Henry VII. It destroyed Henry VIII long before he ever sat on the throne. The young Henry Tudor, second son, second in priority, second in destiny, suddenly found himself thrust into a role he was never prepared for. He watched his father unravel. He watched the court shrink into paranoia. He watched every noble family forced into debt or obedience. He watched his father cling to money because love had failed him. And most of all, he watched himself become the desperate focus of Henry VII's terror. Every step was monitored. Every friendship is scrutinized. Every bit of education is controlled. Every move is restricted. Henry VIII grew up in a cage of his father's fear, a cage forged in gold. This is the part of Tudor history people forget. Henry VIII's lifelong obsession with securing a male heir, his panic at the thought of losing lineage, his rage when sons died, his terror that the Tudor line would collapse, all of it came from the trauma of watching his father fall apart after Arthur's death. The fear of extinction, the fear of losing everything, the fear of dynastic collapse, Henry VIII inherited it alongside the crown, and he would later burn his kingdom trying to escape that fear. Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Catherine Howard, their deaths were the shadow of Arthur's. Harold Godwinson died for England. Edward II died for love. Henry VIII's wives died from a fear born in a sick room at Ludlow Castle. This is the hidden truth with heirs began not with Henry VIII, but with Henry VII, broken by grief and convinced that God was warning him the dynasty would fail. As the years passed, Henry VII withdrew more and more from the world. He locked himself away in private chambers. He refused to attend tournaments and celebrations. He grew gaunt, pale, ghost-like, a king who seemed to be fading while still alive. Ambassadors described him as a man consumed, a king turned inward, a ruler who trusts nothing. He interrogated his own council. He ordered surveillance of nobles he once considered allies. He demanded payments from families already ruined. He forced loyalty through fear rather than respect. And always the gold. Room after room, chest after chest, vault after vault. England groaned under the weight of a king who no longer ruled out of duty, but out of dread. Richard II had feared losing divine authority. Harold Godwinson had feared losing the kingdom's safety. Henry VII feared losing the future itself. Fear made him powerful. Fear made him wealthy. Fear made him cruel. And yet, beneath that cruelty, beneath the walls of gold and the paranoid commands and the cold calculations, there was a grieving father still blaming himself for the death of a boy who had once promised England a world without war. People at court whispered that Henry VII never recovered from the moment he saw Arthur's empty bed. They said he spoke to God at night, asking why the son meant to secure peace was the one taken first. They said he held one of Arthur's letters in his private chambers, reading it when he believed no one was watching. They said he refused to let musicians play lively songs, as if joy itself was a betrayal. And most haunting of all, they said the king sometimes wandered the palace corridors late at night, calling Arthur's name. Whether any of that is true does not matter. What matters is that people believed it, because the transformation was undeniable. They saw a king who once ruled with strategy, now ruling with fear. A king who once built alliances, now is dismantling them. A king who once brought England together, now tightening chains around its nobility. A king who once dreamed of legacy, now barricading himself behind gold. This was not Henry VII, the founder. This was Henry VII, the survivor, trapped in a world that kept taking everything he loved. And a king who fears loss is a king who becomes dangerous. By the turn of the 16th century, Henry VII had ceased to resemble the king he once promised England he would be. Gone was the determined victor of Bosworth. Gone was the diplomatic architect who stitched a shattered nation back together. Gone was the careful strategist who built peace through marriage and treaties. What remained was a man hollowed out by grief, encircled by wealth, and terrified of the world outside his counting rooms. His courtiers said the palace felt colder whenever he walked through it, as if he dragged winter behind him. Even ambassadors from foreign courts noticed. They wrote home describing a king whose eyes seemed to stare past them, as if searching for someone who was no longer there. Death had taken Arthur. Death had taken Elizabeth of York. Death had taken the peace Henry had spent his life pursuing. And now death was circling him. His health began to fail, slowly. Then, all at once, a cough that would not leave, a fever that grew worse each night, long days spent in darkened rooms, surrounded by ledgers instead of people. He still commanded his treasurers to bring him gold, as if the weight of it in his hands might anchor him to life. But even gold cannot bribe the grave. In February 1509, Henry VII felt his strength slip away. Those who visited him said his voice had become a whisper, his face a skull beneath parchment skin. Yet, even in his final days, the fear did not leave him. He kept asking the same question: is the realm secure? He did not ask for comfort, or forgiveness, or even Arthur. He asked if England would survive. Because Henry VII, the king who had survived against all odds, could not bear the thought that his dynasty might not survive him. On April 21st, 1509, as dawn crept through the windows of Richmond Palace, the king's breathing grew shallow. He clutched the sheets with thin, trembling fingers. He whispered a prayer learned in childhood, a prayer for deliverance, for mercy, for peace. But Henry VII died with the same emotion that had shaped his entire reign: fear. There was no triumphant farewell, no kingly speech, no final act of authority. There was only the labored breath of a man who had spent a lifetime running, a man who rarely trusted love when he saw it, a man who believed survival required sacrifice, and who sacrificed everything but sorrow. The moment he died, those who had feared him began to breathe freely again. His ministers hurried to conceal his death until they could secure the succession. And the boy he left behind, 17-year-old Henry VIII, ran into the sunlight, hungry to escape the suffocating shadow of his father. They buried Henry VII in Westminster Abbey, beside Elizabeth of York, the wife he had loved, the woman whose death had broken him. Their tomb is magnificent, but the story it holds is devastating. Inside lies the king who won England through brilliance and ruled it through fear. When Henry VIII ascended the throne, the kingdom rejoiced. People tore down the financial bonds Henry VII had imposed. They celebrated the end of the miser king. They welcomed his charismatic, golden-skinned son as if England had been liberated. But that celebration masked a truth darker than any medieval chronicle would admit. Henry VIII inherited more than a crown. He inherited a curse. He inherited his father's fear of extinction, his father's obsession with heirs, his father's terror that a single death could unravel a dynasty. Henry VIII never knew Arthur as a brother, but he lived every day in the shadow of Arthur's absence. Arthur was the ghost in his marriage with Catherine of Aragon. Arthur was the echo in every stillborn child. Arthur was the unseen judge every time Henry looked at an infant and prayed it would be a boy. The trauma that consumed Henry VII became the terror that ruled Henry VIII. Anne Boleyn lost her head because of a fear born in Ludlow. Catherine Howard died because of a fear born in Ludlow. Jane Seymour broke her body for a son because of a fear born in Ludlow. The Reformation itself, the break with Rome, the executions, the destruction of monasteries, all stem from the insecurity Henry VIII carried from childhood. The insecurity his father taught him. The insecurity Arthur's death carved into the Tudor psyche. England's greatest upheaval began not with ambition, but with grief. Look closely, and you find that the Tudors were never a story of power. They were a story of fear. Fear of rebellion, fear of weak heirs, fear of God's judgment, fear of repeating history, fear of losing the fragile kingdom bought in blood. And all of that fear comes back to one room in Ludlow Castle, one sickbed, one dying boy. Arthur's death is the true beginning of the Tudor tragedy. Had Arthur lived, Henry VIII might never have ruled. England might never have broken with Rome. Anne Boleyn might never have been executed. Elizabeth I might never have been born. Shakespeare might never have written in the England she shaped. One fever rewrote the world. And Henry VII, the king who feared that everything could be lost, was right. Because when Arthur died, everything changed. So, what are we to make of Henry VII? Was he a wise king who became paranoid? A survivor who never learned to stop surviving? A father broken by grief? A ruler twisted by fear? A man who saved England only to become a prisoner of the ghosts he defeated? Or was he something even more tragic? A king who spent his entire life running from death, only to be destroyed by the one death he could not prevent? History paints Henry VII as cold, calculating, miserly. But look deeper, and you see a man who loved too fiercely and feared too completely. A man who believed gold could shield him from fate. A man who believed control could replace certainty. A man who believed that if he held on tightly enough, he could keep the world from breaking. But the world broke anyway, and he broke it. Which leaves us with one haunting question. Is survival still victory if it costs you everything that makes survival worth living? Henry VII did win the crown. He did build a dynasty. He did create stability out of chaos. But the price was his peace, his joy, his humanity. And the trauma he carried became the terror that defined the Tudors. If this story helped you see history differently, tell us in the comments. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Hidden Crowns. Because the past is full of kings who survived the battlefield only to be defeated by their own hearts. And every crown casts a shadow.